The courtroom in Athens falls silent as the 70-year-old philosopher rises to defend himself against charges that would cost him his life. Socrates, the man who taught generations to question everything, now faces his own final examination. The accusation? Corrupting the youth and refusing to acknowledge the gods of the city. But there's something deeper happening here, something that transcends ancient Greek politics. The prosecutor's voice trembles not with anger but with fear. Fear of a man who dares to say, "I know that I know nothing," including whether the gods exist at all. 24 centuries later, that same tremor of fear echoes in a school board meeting in Dover, Pennsylvania. Parents argue passionately about whether children should learn evolution alongside creation stories. But listen carefully to their words, and you'll hear something that goes beyond mere disagreement about curriculum. You'll hear the same existential terror that gripped those Athenian citizens who voted to execute Socrates. The fear isn't really about science textbooks or moral education. It's about something far more fundamental, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there's nothing beyond the material world we can see and touch. This fear of atheism runs deeper than opposition to any other belief system, deeper than religious wars, deeper than doctrinal disputes between faiths. A Christian might disagree with a Muslim about the nature of God, but they both agree that God exists. A Hindu might reject Buddhist teachings about the path to enlightenment, but they share a common understanding that there are spiritual realities beyond the physical world. But atheism? Atheism suggests that all of it, every prayer, every sacred text, every moment of transcendent experience, might be nothing more than wishful thinking. In 1633, Galileo Galilei kneels before the Roman Inquisition, forced to recant his support for the idea that Earth revolves around the sun. The Church's opposition seems to be about astronomy, but the deeper fear is about humanity's place in the cosmos. If Earth isn't the center of the universe, if humans aren't the focal point of creation, then what does that say about divine purpose? What terrifies the Inquisitors isn't Galileo's mathematics. It's the possibility that his discoveries might lead people to conclude that the universe operates according to natural laws rather than divine will. The trial transcript reveals something fascinating. The prosecutors don't spend much time arguing with Galileo about orbital mechanics. Instead, they focus obsessively on what they see as the logical endpoint of his thinking. A universe that doesn't need God's constant intervention, where natural processes explain everything we observe. They're not fighting a battle about astronomy, they're fighting a war against the possibility of a godless cosmos. This pattern repeats throughout history with striking consistency. Religious authorities can negotiate with competing theologies, can find common ground with different interpretations of the divine, can even adapt to new scientific discoveries. But they struggle desperately when confronted with the simple assertion that supernatural explanations might be unnecessary. Consider the strange case of Pierre-Simon Laplace, the French mathematician who developed groundbreaking theories about celestial mechanics in the early 1800s. When Napoleon Bonaparte asked him where God fit into his mathematical model of the solar system, Laplace famously replied, "I have no need of that hypothesis." Napoleon, himself no stranger to challenging authority, was reportedly so unsettled by this response that he warned Laplace to keep such thoughts to himself. What's remarkable about Napoleon's reaction is that he had just conquered most of Europe, had overthrown kings and redrew national boundaries, had challenged virtually every traditional source of power. But a mathematician suggesting that the universe might operate without divine intervention? That was apparently a step too far. The fear becomes even more evident when we examine how different religious traditions respond to atheism compared to how they respond to each other. The Crusades were brutal religious wars, but they were fought between groups who agreed about the fundamental nature of reality. They just disagreed about which version of God was correct. Medieval Islamic scholars engaged in respectful debates with Christian theologians, arguing about the details of divine revelation while sharing common assumptions about the existence of spiritual realms. But when Islamic philosophers like Abu Bakr al-Razi suggested in the 10th century that reason alone, without revelation, could guide human behavior, the response was swift and harsh. Al-Razi wasn't promoting a competing religion. He was questioning whether religion itself was necessary. The theological establishment didn't just disagree with him, they tried to erase his works from history. Most of his writings on religion were destroyed, surviving only in fragments quoted by his critics. The same pattern appears in ancient India, where Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain philosophers engaged in sophisticated debates about the nature of enlightenment, the cycle of rebirth, and the best path to spiritual liberation. These traditions disagreed about almost everything, but they could coexist because they shared fundamental assumptions about the spiritual dimension of reality. But when the Charvaka school emerged, teaching that consciousness was simply a product of material processes and that death was the absolute end of existence, the response was different. The Charvakas weren't proposing an alternative spiritual path. They were suggesting that all spiritual paths led nowhere because there was nowhere spiritual to go. Their texts were systematically destroyed, and they were excluded from philosophical debates not because their arguments were weak, but because their conclusions were too threatening to engage with seriously. Hello, curious minds. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the psychological and historical forces that have shaped human civilization in ways you might never have considered. Before we continue exploring this fascinating dynamic, I'm really curious about our audience today. Where are you watching from right now? Are you in a place where religious and secular worldviews coexist peacefully, or somewhere where these tensions still run high? And here's something that might give us insight into different perspectives. What do you do for work? Are you perhaps a teacher navigating these discussions in educational settings? Maybe a counselor helping people work through faith transitions? A historian studying religious movements? Or someone in the sciences who encounters these tensions professionally? Your background probably shapes how you're experiencing this exploration. The arrival of Darwinian evolution in the 19th century provides perhaps the clearest example of how religious fear focuses specifically on atheistic implications rather than scientific details. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, the initial religious response was surprisingly measured. Many Christian scientists found ways to reconcile evolution with their faith, arguing that God could work through natural selection just as easily as through direct creation. But as the implications of evolutionary theory spread beyond biology, the fear intensified dramatically. If humans shared common ancestry with other animals, if the complexity of life could emerge through natural processes, if no divine intervention was needed to explain the diversity of species, then what role was left for God? The real terror wasn't about monkey ancestors. It was about the possibility that the appearance of design in nature might not require a designer. Thomas Huxley, Darwin's most aggressive defender, understood this fear perfectly and seemed to relish exploiting it. In his debates with religious authorities, Huxley didn't just argue for evolution. He explicitly drew the atheistic conclusions that religious leaders feared most. He spoke openly about a universe that operated according to natural laws without any need for supernatural intervention. He wasn't content to make room for God within evolutionary theory. He wanted to demonstrate that God was an unnecessary hypothesis. The religious establishment's response revealed their deepest anxieties. They could have focused on reconciling evolution with creation stories, could have developed theological frameworks that incorporated natural selection, could have argued that God worked through natural processes. Instead, many chose to reject evolution entirely, not because the scientific evidence was weak, but because accepting it seemed to open the door to a worldview that had no place for the divine. This same pattern played out again in the 20th century with the development of modern cosmology. When Georges Lemaitre, a Catholic priest and physicist, proposed what would become known as the Big Bang theory, the initial religious response was enthusiastic. Here was scientific evidence for a moment of creation, apparent confirmation of the biblical account of the universe having a beginning. But as cosmologists began developing theories about what caused the Big Bang, how the universe might have emerged from quantum fluctuations, and whether multiple universes might exist, the religious enthusiasm cooled rapidly. Scientists like Stephen Hawking weren't content to identify the moment of creation. They wanted to understand whether creation required a creator. When Hawking wrote that if we find the answer to why the universe exists, It would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. He probably intended the reference to God as metaphorical, but his later, more explicit statements about the universe's ability to create itself from nothing triggered the familiar religious anxiety about unnecessary divine hypotheses. The fear reveals itself most clearly in how religious authorities respond to different types of atheism. Philosophical atheism that engages seriously with religious arguments, that acknowledges the emotional and psychological needs that religion addresses, that treats faith traditions with respect while disagreeing with their conclusions. This kind of atheism often generates thoughtful theological responses and productive dialogue. But atheism that simply dismisses religion as irrelevant, that treats religious questions as meaningless, that suggests human beings can live fulfilling lives without any spiritual dimension, this kind of atheism triggers much more intense anxiety. The fear isn't about losing intellectual debates, it's about becoming obsolete, about discovering that the questions religion claims to answer might not actually need answers. Consider the different religious responses to two prominent atheists, Antony Flew and Richard Dawkins. Flew, a philosopher who spent decades developing sophisticated arguments against theism before surprisingly converting to deism late in life, was generally treated with respect by religious intellectuals even during his atheist years. His arguments were taken seriously, his scholarship was acknowledged, and his eventual conversion was celebrated as vindication of religious rationality. Dawkins, by contrast, generates much more hostile reactions despite being a distinguished scientist with legitimate expertise in evolutionary biology. The difference isn't in their intellectual credentials, it's in their implications. Flew argued that religious claims were false. Dawkins suggests they're unnecessary. Flew engaged with theology as if it mattered. Dawkins treats it as a historical curiosity. Religious authorities can debate someone who takes their enterprise seriously, but they struggle to engage with someone who sees it as fundamentally pointless. The psychological roots of this fear run deep into human nature's relationship with uncertainty and meaning. Religious worldviews provide comprehensive answers to humanity's most fundamental questions. Why does anything exist? What's the purpose of life? What happens when we die? How should we treat each other? These aren't merely intellectual curiosities, they're existential necessities for most human beings. Other religious traditions might provide different answers to these questions, but they validate the importance of the questions themselves. Even competing religions affirm that these are the right questions to ask, that some answers are better than others, that spiritual reality provides the proper context for understanding human existence. Atheism, particularly in its more thorough forms, suggests something far more threatening, that these might be the wrong questions entirely. What if there's no ultimate purpose to discover? What if consciousness simply emerges from complex neural activity and ceases at death? What if moral principles are human constructions rather than cosmic truths? What if the universe is exactly as purposeless and indifferent as it appears through the lens of modern science? This possibility strikes at the foundation of religious consciousness in a way that competing religious claims do not. A Christian can argue with a Muslim about the nature of divine revelation, while both agreeing that divine revelation exists. A Buddhist can disagree with a Hindu about the mechanics of karma, while both accepting that actions have spiritual consequences. But atheism questions whether any of these spiritual categories correspond to reality. The historical response to this challenge has been remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. Religious authorities don't just argue against atheistic conclusions, they often refuse to engage with atheistic premises. They change the subject from evidence to faith, from logic to revelation, from natural explanations to supernatural mysteries. This isn't necessarily intellectual dishonesty, it might be psychological necessity. The early Christian apologist Tertullian captured this dynamic perfectly in his famous declaration, "I believe because it is absurd." He wasn't celebrating irrationality. He was acknowledging that faith operates in a different sphere from reason, that religious truth claims aren't vulnerable to rational criticism because they don't depend on rational justification. This approach has protected religious worldviews from atheistic challenges for centuries, but it has also revealed the depth of religious anxiety about those challenges. The need to place faith beyond the reach of reason suggests an implicit acknowledgement that reason might not support faith's conclusions. Modern neuroscience has added new dimensions to this ancient fear by offering increasingly sophisticated explanations for religious experiences themselves. Studies showing that meditation activates specific brain regions, that psychedelic drugs can trigger experiences indistinguishable from mystical revelations, that religious visions correlate with temporal lobe activity. These findings don't disprove the reality of spiritual realms, but they suggest that spiritual experiences might have purely natural explanations. The religious response to neuroscientific studies of religion reveals the same fundamental anxiety. Religious authorities could argue that God works through brain chemistry, that neural activity is simply the mechanism through which spiritual realities manifest. That correlation doesn't prove causation. Some do make these arguments, and they're not unreasonable. But many religious leaders seem more threatened by neuroscientific investigations than by traditional philosophical challenges to faith. They worry that if religious experiences can be explained naturalistically, people will conclude that they can be dismissed naturalistically. The fear isn't about the scientific details, it's about the atheistic implications. The rise of secular humanism in the 20th century particularly intensified these anxieties because it demonstrated that atheism could be more than mere negation. Secular humanists didn't just reject religious claims, they offered alternative foundations for ethics, meaning, and community that didn't require supernatural assumptions. Organizations like the American Humanist Association and the Council for Secular Humanism began providing services traditionally offered by religious institutions: community gatherings, life cycle ceremonies, charitable activities, and moral education. They demonstrated that human beings could create meaningful lives, strong communities, and ethical frameworks without any reference to divine authority or spiritual realms. This development represented religious institutions' worst nightmare, not just intellectual opposition to their truth claims, but practical competition for their social functions. If people could find purpose, community, and moral guidance through secular organizations, what unique value did religious institutions provide? The response has been telling. Religious leaders often express more hostility towards secular humanist organizations than toward competing religious traditions. They can share interfaith platforms with representatives of other faiths, can participate in ecumenical activities, can find common ground with different theological perspectives. But they struggle to engage constructively with organizations that explicitly reject the need for theological perspectives altogether. The internet age has amplified these dynamics by making atheistic perspectives more visible and accessible than ever before. Online communities allow isolated atheists to connect with like-minded individuals, to access sophisticated arguments against religious belief, and to realize that non-religious worldviews are intellectually respectable and emotionally sustainable. Religious authorities have responded to this digital challenge with revealing patterns of anxiety. They've developed extensive apologetic websites, have trained specialists in countering atheistic arguments, and have invested heavily in online evangelism. But they've also often resorted to blocking, censoring, or avoiding atheistic content rather than engaging with it directly. The comment sections of religious websites frequently reveal this discomfort. Thoughtful questions from religious seekers receive careful, nuanced responses. Challenges from competing religious perspectives generate respectful theological dialogue. But atheistic comments often get deleted, ignored, or dismissed without serious consideration. The pattern suggests that religious authorities find atheistic perspectives uniquely difficult to address. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of religious fear of atheism involves children and education. Religious parents regularly send their children to schools alongside peers from different faith traditions without excessive anxiety. They might prefer religious education, but they generally accept that exposure to religious diversity won't automatically undermine their children's faith. But atheistic perspectives in education trigger much more intense parental anxiety. The battles over evolution in science classes, the controversies over secular philosophy and humanities courses, the resistance to comparative religion studies that present atheism as a legitimate worldview. These conflicts reveal deep fears about atheism's unique potential to undermine religious belief. The fear seems to be that while children can learn about other religions without losing their own faith, learning about atheism might make them question whether any faith is necessary. Other religious traditions implicitly validate the importance of religious belief. Atheism questions whether religious belief serves any useful purpose at all. This educational anxiety has driven some of the most intense political mobilization by religious communities in modern American history. The efforts to promote school prayer, to include creationism in science curricula, to allow religious symbols in public schools. These campaigns aren't usually motivated by opposition to specific religious alternatives, but by fear of secular educational environments that treat religious and non-religious worldviews as equally valid options. The global perspective on these dynamics reveals interesting cultural variations while confirming underlying patterns. In countries with strong secular traditions like France or the Czech Republic, religious communities have learned to coexist with atheistic perspectives and often demonstrate less anxiety about atheistic challenges. But even in these contexts, the historical record shows that secularization wasn't easily accepted by religious authorities. In countries where religion maintains stronger social authority, like the United States or much of the Middle East, atheism continues to trigger particularly strong reactions. The pattern suggests that religious fear of atheism correlates with religious social power. The more a society depends on religious institutions for meaning and order, the more threatening atheistic alternatives appear. The psychological research on religious belief and apostasy provides additional insight into these dynamics. Studies show that people find it relatively easy to switch between religious traditions that share common assumptions about spiritual reality. Converting from Christianity to Islam or from Hinduism to Buddhism requires changing beliefs about the nature of the divine, but doesn't require abandoning concepts like purpose, transcendence, or spiritual meaning. But transitioning from religious belief to atheism involves a more fundamental cognitive shift. It requires not just changing answers to spiritual questions, but questioning whether those questions have meaningful answers. It involves rebuilding one's entire conceptual framework for understanding existence, morality, and meaning. The psychological difficulty of this transition helps explain why religious authorities view it as uniquely threatening. The emergence of new atheism in the early 21st century crystallized many of these fears in contemporary form. Authors like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett didn't just argue against religious belief, they argued that religious belief was actively harmful to human civilization. They suggested that the world would be better off if religion disappeared entirely. This approach triggered religious responses that revealed deep anxieties about relevance and survival. Religious leaders who had learned to engage respectfully with modernist theology, liberal religious movements, and interfaith dialogue struggled to respond to critics who saw religion itself as a problem to be solved rather than a tradition to be reformed or reinterpreted. The new atheist emphasis on religion's potential for violence, irrationality, and social harm struck at religious communities' sense of their own moral authority. Most religious leaders could acknowledge that their traditions had sometimes been misused or corrupted, but they insisted that authentic religious faith was a force for good in the world. Atheistic arguments that questioned this fundamental assumption, that suggested religious belief itself, regardless of its specific content, might be socially destructive, challenged religious self-understanding in unprecedented ways. The defensive religious responses to new atheist criticisms often revealed more anxiety than confidence about religion's social value. The ongoing debates about artificial intelligence and consciousness are beginning to replicate these historical patterns in new forms. As AI systems become increasingly sophisticated, they raise questions about the nature of mind, consciousness, and intelligence that could have profound implications for religious worldviews. If consciousness can emerge from purely computational processes, if intelligence doesn't require any non-material substrate, if mind is simply what brains do rather than evidence of souls, then many traditional religious concepts about human uniqueness and spiritual reality might need fundamental revision. Religious responses to AI development already show familiar patterns of anxiety about naturalistic explanations for phenomena traditionally understood in spiritual terms. The fear isn't about the technology itself, but about the atheistic implications of viewing consciousness as an emergent property of complex information processing, rather than evidence of divine creation. The climate change debate has also revealed these dynamics in unexpected ways. Environmental crises raise fundamental questions about human responsibility, planetary stewardship, and the relationship between scientific and moral authority that intersect with religious concerns in complex ways. Many religious leaders have embraced environmental activism as an expression of spiritual values, finding ways to integrate climate science with theological commitments. But some religious communities have resisted environmental movements not primarily because of disagreements about scientific data, but because of anxiety about the secular moral authority that environmental activism represents. The fear seems to be that if scientific institutions can claim moral authority about humanity's relationship with nature, if secular environmental organizations can mobilize people around ultimate values and purposes, if concern for the planet can provide meaning and community without reference to divine commands, then what unique role do religious institutions play in addressing humanity's deepest challenges? Looking toward the future, these tensions seem likely to intensify rather than resolve. Scientific understanding continues to expand into domains previously reserved for religious explanation. Secular institutions continue to develop capabilities for providing meaning, community, and moral guidance that were once exclusively religious functions. Global communication makes atheistic perspectives more visible and accessible than ever before. But the persistence of religious belief despite centuries of atheistic challenges also suggests that religion addresses human needs that purely rational worldviews might struggle to satisfy. The search for meaning, the need for community, the desire for transcendence, the requirement for moral framework, these aspects of human nature seem remarkably resistant to purely secular alternatives. Perhaps the future lies not in the triumph of either religious or atheistic worldviews, but in their continued coexistence and mutual influence. Religious traditions that learn to incorporate scientific insights while maintaining their essential spiritual insights might prove more resilient than those that resist secular challenges entirely. Atheistic movements that acknowledge the psychological and social functions that religion serves might develop more effective alternatives than those that simply dismiss religious needs as irrational. The story of religious fear of atheism ultimately reveals something profound about human nature itself. Our simultaneous needs for both rational understanding and transcendent meaning, for both scientific explanation and spiritual purpose, for both individual autonomy and cosmic significance. The tension between religious and atheistic worldviews might not be a problem to be solved, but a creative friction that drives both traditions toward deeper insights about the human condition. From that courtroom in ancient Athens where Socrates faced death for questioning divine authority, to the modern laboratories where neuroscientists study the biological basis of religious experience, the dialogue between faith and doubt continues to shape human civilization. The fear is real, the stakes are high, and the questions remain as urgent today as they were 24 centuries ago. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of one of humanity's most enduring intellectual and emotional conflicts. If this examination resonated with you, I'd love to hear your perspective on these dynamics. Have you witnessed these tensions in your own community or personal experience? Do you see them as destructive conflicts or productive dialogues? How do you think religious and secular worldviews can coexist constructively in pluralistic societies? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more deep dives into the psychological and historical forces that continue to shape our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep wrestling with the big questions that make us human.